Hello, Germantown. How are you today? This is Dr. Stephanie Heck. I am the host of the Not So Hidden Agenda. I am coming to you on Germantown Community Radio, 92.9 FM, WGGT-LP, or you could be streaming me on gtownradio.com. Welcome once again to the next episode in my series that I am calling Coping with Coronavirus. In case you haven't heard yet, this series is a bunch of conversations that I'm having with my expert psychology colleagues. We're talking over Zoom and I'm recording them for you about how we can understand ourselves and what we're dealing with during this unprecedented quarantine. And also hopefully to give you some guidance about how we can cope with quarantine life. So today, my special guest is Dr. Eric Spiegel. He is here to talk to us about quarantine loneliness. Because this is an area that he's been thinking a lot about lately. And just to give you some background, Dr. Spiegel is the co-author of the book Attachment and Group Psychotherapy. He's also an expert in attachment and group dynamics. He's the past president of the American Society of Clinical Hypnosis, so we're super lucky to have him here. Hello, Dr. Spiegel.
Hi, Stephanie. It's great to be here with you. And this is such a different way of being together on the radio than the norm, right? But I guess
exactly. It is, yes. And thank you for doing it. I know it's a funny thing to like record. It's sort of like of course our audience can't tell, but we're Zooming right now.
Exactly.
It's different from being in the studio, but we're making it work.
Exactly. And I mean, in a great way, that's a nice place to start with this topic, because it really just shows how in the end, people are so adaptable and resilient, and just really have the capability to roll with the punches and figure out new things about themselves. And that's kind of one of the reasons I got interested in this topic, because it's like loneliness involves such pain and grief on the one hand, but it can also really be an opportunity to get to a new level of knowing yourself and discovering things about yourself that help you to cope in ways that you hadn't expected.
Well, I'm glad that you're going to talk to us about that then, because I'm sure that so many people could use some time to kind of pause and reflect on that, and maybe then think about what they can do.
Yeah, and it's interesting, because I think as a psychologist, one of the things that makes this time really unique is that we're not so removed from our clients, our patients in that regard, because we're all going through this together. This is just so unprecedented. So, I mean, I know that that's something I've been thinking about, in my own life, just kind of about how we can really take this space and, make something meaningful out of it. And it's a challenge for folks, because I think that, this aspect of uncertainty, of like not knowing, hey, is this lockdown, this stay at home, the shelter in place, whatever you want to call it. I mean, there's so many names for it, right? Like, is it going to be a month? Well, hey, now a lot of us are coming up on 2 months. Is it going to be 3 months? Is it going to be 6 months? I mean, it's the aspect of uncertainty that I think that is hard for people. But the way that I kind of try to work on my clients with it is I say, look, you are limited right now by what you know in this present moment. But imagine right now, it's a year from now, and this is all over. There's a vaccine. People have gone back to, a sense of some kind of normality, although obviously that may change. And you're looking back at this, and now you could say, okay, I knew that I was going to have 6 months, or I was going to have a year, unlike any other time in my life, right? And that at the end of that time, I could go back to my life. How would I want to spend it? And I think that completely changes the paradigm. It takes out, the uncertainty, and it really kind of gives you that chance to sort of sit with the space and make a choice for yourself. And I think that's ultimately where the promise lies.
Mm-hmm. Right. I've had the same thought, that it's sort of like if you can reframe this time as an opportunity. I mean, I know it's hard because we're all kind of exhausted and there's a lot of losses, and we're kind of like using energy, just keeping it together.
Right.
In the moments when you can kind of see a little bit of the bigger picture, which is what I think you're saying, it sort of helps. I know for me, it's sort of like to think about all the things that I've complained that I can't get done,
Right.
and all the times I've wished, like, God, if I could just have a break, maybe I could do that. I could write my book. I could, whatever, record an interview with Eric Spiegel, you know, all these wishes of mine. Now there's some time.
Well, I mean that, and that's a great way of saying it too, because it's like if you could stay open to these possibilities, then when they come, you're really able to seize them, and that makes it a lot of fun. I was thinking, Stephanie, when you were saying that about how um, it's so much is in how we frame the moment. So much is in how we say to ourselves what we want this moment to be. And it's very easy to kind of go like moment to moment to moment and not have that big picture. But I really feel like this is affording us a space to kind of ask those bigger questions, to say to yourself, okay, well, um, if I'm not making my commute today, if I'm working from home, um, how do I want to spend that extra time? Or if I am somebody who's an essential worker and I have to go on the job, but the workplace is completely different. Maybe there are less people in the job, or maybe there are people in the job, but the interactions are different. How do I want that moment to be? So we all have a choice to be with ourselves in a different way because of um, the shift in the environment. And I think that that's something that I'd like to talk more about with you. This idea of like
Mhm.
the more active action kind of task-based way of living, the doing, and then the more sort of existential being, mindfulness kind of stuff where you're just like sitting in the space, and kind of how people can kind of use both of those in helpful ways, to cope with loneliness, because that's why I'm here, is to talk to you about that.
Right. Yeah, that sounds great. Just out of curiosity, before we get into that, I was
Yeah.
wondering if you could set the stage for us a little bit, just in terms of what you're seeing, maybe in your practice or in life, or hearing from your friends. Are you feeling that we're all sort of lonely in a way, even if we're with our families, versus there are people who are kind of like single and on their own right now? I mean, I know I have some patients in that boat, and it can be pretty lonely. Oh,
Yeah, what's interesting is, I don't know if this has been your experience. I've found that it's really variable. So,
mhm.
you've got some people who are, living with young kids, and life is just packed. Maybe it's a two-career household, and the parents are going stir crazy because they just, everything is on top of themselves. And I think,
Mm,
what a lot of those people are saying to me, they're saying like, I just feel like one day kind of goes into the next and time is
yeah.
just flying by, right? So that's one experience. Then you also have parents with older kids, right, who might have just like gone off to college or gotten jobs, and they were adjusting to empty nest kind of
Mm,
stuff, and now all of a sudden their older kids are home. And I think like a lot of those people are talking about, what an incredible opportunity this has afforded them. It's almost like they were grieving a death of some sorts, of like the end of their nuclear family. And now everybody's back together. The gang's back together again, but then I also talk to grandparents, who went from, if they were in town and they were seeing their kids every week, if they're not in that same bubble, they may now have been going 2 months without seeing their grandkids. Or if they were out of town but it was close driving distance, there's a loss there. I have one client, whose child just gave birth to their first grandchild,
mm.
but they're on the West Coast
Yeah.
and they can't see them, and it's just so painful. So, I think there's just been so many different stories and different circumstances involved.
Right. And you were saying that um, it's useful to be mindful about the actions we take, sort of like as a way to
Right.
kind of take these moments. I know everybody's in their own situation. You're describing some of them. I'm
Yeah.
sure there are different people who relate to all of those things you're saying. Um, but what are you having? Like, I guess I just want to know how you're framing it to them. or what are you advising?
Well, I think it's really important in therapy to find the right balance between staying with somebody's emotional experience. Like, you know, my therapy practice is called Attune Philadelphia Therapy Group, and I laugh just because I often use this word attune. Like, it's important to be attuned to your client's experience, to really listen to them. Um, and I think that's one aspect of it. And then the second aspect of it is like giving them something concrete, giving them tangible skills. And it's a little bit like riding on a seesaw with somebody. Like, you go too much and you get out of balance, but then you go too much the other way and you get out of balance. And I think in a way what we're trying to do is find that right balance between, like, you don't want to get too far out ahead. You don't want to get to like the suggestions, the advice, the tips, right? Because then they're just going to feel like they're not really being heard. And I think more than anything with loneliness, that's the hardest part, is feeling like, look, I've got no one around me to talk to, like, in person. I miss that contact. But I
Mhm.
think even more so, it's that sense, like, when they try to talk to family members, friends, they feel like their family members can't sit with the pain. Um, Loneliness is inherently like grieving a death. It's a loss. And I think that that's the case whether, this kind of pandemic shelter in place is kind of bringing up old aspects of loneliness, like people have just maybe felt disconnected or alone to begin with, and then it intensifies it,
Mhm.
or they're just feeling it for the first time. But I think, either way, it's kind of like it's a death, it's a loss. So if you go too quickly to, like, okay, what are we going to do to help you with this, more the strategies, then I think they don't really fully feel heard. But then I think there are other folks I work with where, I'm joining with them, I'm listening to them, and that just kind of compounds their sense of helplessness, and they really want, like, more concrete strategy. So you need a mix.
Yeah, you need a mix. It's really cool to hear you say too, just to frame loneliness as a loss like that,
Yeah.
or something, something akin to grieving. you know
Yes.
I mean, maybe this is just my thought and maybe it'll resonate. um I think that grieving in and of itself is a pretty isolating experience. Oftentimes you're grieving something and the people around you are not.
That's
And
right.
so in those moments you are kind of on an island, right? And now I guess maybe depending on your circumstances it could feel like a double island. It's sort of like there's a lot of losses and then maybe you are by yourself, or maybe your neighbor knows what we're going through in a sense, but their life hasn't changed to the
Yeah.
same extent that yours has.
I really love your double island metaphor, because I feel like when it was kind of the old way of living, the pre-coronavirus life, which now is feeling like more and more in the rearview mirror, um, it was sort of this thing where it was like people would go through a loss. Let's say they had a loved one who died, or they became injured or infirmed in some way, and they couldn't kind of live their life the way they had used to. And it was sort of like, I think something I'd hear from a lot of people are, well, you know, on the one hand, people who are my friends and family, they understand because they knew the person who died, or they remembered me the way I used to be. But then there's also just this sense of, like, feeling like people at a certain point just kind of want you to get over it. They're like, why are you still sad? Come on, what can you do? So I think that really leaves them feeling alone and on an island. But then, in this kind of iteration of life, um, even though the circumstances have changed, it can be very similar, because it's like, yes, your friend or your family member is also going through the same thing, but they could be going through it in a completely different lifestyle. Like, maybe they're living with a partner, or they're living with
Mhm.
friends and they're not by themselves. Or, I think another thing I hear about, which we might not think to talk about, is there are some people who are in unhappy relationships with partners. And so technically they are living with someone, but they've never felt more alone
Mm.
than they do right now. And that can also be very hard to talk about with family members and with friends, particularly, if it's something that they hadn't previously shared, because it can feel like you're keeping a big secret and you have to kind of put up appearances, but you're silently grieving and alone inside.
Right. That's hard, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I,
how
I
were you? Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, when you said that's hard and you paused for a moment, what it reminded me of is like how hard it is in this work to just sit with that pain, to just tolerate the silences that come up in therapy. Because I think the spaces that happen in a therapy session reflect the spaces that we feel in our lives, right? Where there's just this void and we don't know how to talk about it. We don't know how to feel it. It's very hard for people to tolerate space.
And in this case, maybe space that has to do with loss and grieving,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah. I think that ultimately that's also the glass half full piece to it, because there's real potential. Um, it's like, in a way, you can't begin the process of redefining your relationship with yourself until you acknowledge a space that has come into being for you to begin to kind of re-engage with. So it's like, in a way, um, this kind of loss strips away the denial, which I think gives us this
Mm.
tremendous opportunity to ask ourselves questions about, who we want to become, and to begin to, I maybe would liken it to, like, almost like trying on different hats. Like, oh, what would it be like, if I take on this meditation practice, or if I take on this new hobby that I've never done, or if I start, cooking where I haven't cooked before, or I start journaling, or writing diaries, or writing, or doing art. I mean, there's so many, I think, avenues that people can begin to kind of unlock new relationships with themselves.
And is that what you meant earlier when you were talking about action?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, action can take on many forms. So, particularly with my more extroverted clients, action is more people oriented. And ironically, that's actually a piece of grief that we're not talking about. I think one thing that's been really hard about the lockdown is, I think people who are more extroverted are going out of their minds, because they draw their energy from being with other people, right?
Totally.
And
Yeah.
they want, like, more, action in the way that we think about it. But action can also just be like a more present centered and engaged way of being with ourselves. I think another thing that kind of comes into this, is that we live in an age where a lot of people fill space by going on their cell phones, or checking social media. And of course, that temptation is here now. But I do think, like, now that we're kind of more just in this sort of, like, um, I don't know if chill is the right word, but this kind of, like, more slow lifestyle. Um, there is an opportunity, not to instinctively go to that space filler, and instead to kind of ask yourself, okay, like, hey, what am I feeling right now? What's it like to, be with myself in this moment? What is it like to read this book that I haven't read in a while and feel certain feelings that haven't kind of emerged? So there's action can really take on a lot of forms.
Yeah, I see. I see. And were you saying that there's another side of that? You said I wrote down existential.
Well, I think that, by existential, I mean, like, this sense of the big life questions of, who am I? Who do I want to become? And there's just an action, I think, in asking yourself that question, right? Because a lot of times we tell ourselves, oh, I don't have time to think about that. I've got too much going on. So when those layers of denial are stripped away, and it's like, okay, now I can actually say to myself, like, what's going to give my life meaning? There's a really an opportunity to do something. There's a really an opportunity to, like, engage with yourself, in a way that I think leads to change.
When you say layers of denial, I was wondering if you could just explain, what you
Oh
mean by
my
that to
God.
our
Well,
audience. What would be an example?
okay, I think the most prominent example, and I can never resist this temptation is to talk a little bit of current events. The ultimate example of layers of denial is how President Trump is dealing with this, right? Which is to completely wish away what's happening, to say, it's going to get better, to just kind of like pretend as if things aren't the way that they are. And I think, like, on the one hand, I have tremendous empathy for some people who, are really just kind of itching to get back to work, and are perhaps some people who are protesting the lockdowns. But I think that, when we think about this layers of denial, that's a really great example, because I think, some of the interviews that I've heard on the news with folks who are saying this, they say, I'm just going to kind of pretend that this virus doesn't exist. I'm going to pretend that if I am around other people and I don't social distance, that nothing can happen to me. And it's hard dealing with this invisible menace, but this is what is in front of us. So that's a really concrete example of denial. But I think denial, and
I lost you for a
you
minute
lost
there.
me for a second.
So you were saying, you were talking about layers of denial, and it sort of sounded like you were saying it's like there are some people who act as if they're immune, or like it
Yes.
like they're above it, or somehow it won't apply to them. The virus isn't contagious to them,
And
which is
that's
like
such a great
magical.
word. Right, exactly, like immune. Like, there's not just like actual immunity to a virus, but there's sort of this imagined sense of invulnerability. And that comes back down to the subject, because loneliness is loss, and loss is facing our vulnerability. It's I mean, I hate to get graphic like this, but it's like being in the room with the Grim Reaper. I mean, it's it's being there and just admitting to yourself that the usual BS that you tell yourself doesn't apply. And there's some people, I think, just because of what they've gone through in their life, their own vulnerabilities, they don't want to face that. So, they engage in the magical thinking, they push it away, they say, it's not bad, we can go back to our regular life. None of this is really happening, and the sad thing, I think, is that everyone has to come to terms with this in some way, and you hope that that doesn't happen by people sort of putting themselves at physical risk with this virus. But I think this is really forcing all of us to face this in some capacity. And the people who do better are actually the ones who face it. As hard as it can be to face this kind of emotional and psychological pain, it really opens up the opportunity for there to be a next chapter. There's actually a concept in psychology called post-traumatic growth. We
Yeah,
often think
I love
about,
that.
right, post-traumatic stress disorder, but this is post-traumatic growth. This is, kind of coming through the fire on the other side. And to come back, when you have magical thinking and you have layers of denial, all you're doing is you're just kicking that can down the road.
I see.
And right.
I
Right.
see. Yeah, because that's funny that you went there, because that was my next question. Is sort of like, so how does all of this, um, I don't know, sweeping away of denial help to remediate loneliness? And I guess you're saying that, maybe it doesn't in that exact moment, or maybe there's something about being more deeply in touch with yourself that actually could be helpful. But you're also saying on the other side of the quarantine, like once we have a vaccine, like you were saying at the very beginning, um, things will be different then. You'll
Things
be
will
able
be
to
different.
roll with it.
That's right.
You'll come out changed in some way that's helpful.
And um, some of my clients say things like, um, I can't believe that I haven't taken on a new hobby, or I haven't learned anything, or I haven't, mastered a new skill. And that's only one way of being different. That's great. If you can do that, more power to you. It's really exciting. Um, But, you know, coming out on the other side can also just be kind of coming out on the other side of your relationship with yourself, having learned something about yourself that you didn't know before, being more able to sit with and tolerate an emotion that you previously thought would have been completely unbearable, being
Hmm.
more honest with yourself, and finding the ability to laugh at things that previously would have felt deathly serious. I mean, those are some examples of coming out on the other side in our relationships with ourselves.
Right. Yeah. So that's interesting because it's like sitting in this space, in some ways ultimately lightens the load, right? When you're talking about like laughing at yourself for something that might have felt very serious, right? It's sort of like
Right,
rather than, your partner reflecting something back to you and you feel defensive, they might reflect it back to you and you can say, oh my gosh, is that right? And start laughing, kind of
right.
enjoy that you might have like ridiculous aspects of who you are, like we all
That's
do.
such a great example. I mean, that's such a great example. And what I loved about your example is that, you know, I think when people act defensively, like they're in a fight with their partner, it's almost like this kind of instinctive reaction, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, they made fun of me, I've got to defend myself,
Right.
right? People don't think about that. And now all of a sudden you've got the space to think about it and be like, oh, well, how do I want to be right now? And right, you could laugh at it, and then when that happens, it's like, oh my God, I kind of rose above that. It just kind of rolled off my shoulder. It didn't bother me in the way that it used to. And I think then people feel tremendous mastery, like, oh my God, if I can
Right.
do that, I can do other things.
Right. Because I mean, let's face it, like we all have flaws.
Right.
And in some ways, just owning them, owning it, knowing it sort of takes their power away, right? It doesn't have to be like, oh, you're flawed and that's bad. It can be like, oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I know I do that, huh? Exactly.
We're living with our flaws, you
We're
know,
living with our flaws.
if we don't have a roommate, we certainly have the roommate of our flaws
Yeah, right. And
taking up real estate.
I like how you brought in the concept of post-traumatic growth, because that's something that, like there post-traumatic growth, there's another concept that I'm sure as an author of attachment books, you've thought about, earned security, like where you can have
Yeah.
a relationship that changes, you from having a kind of like more troubled attachment history to something that looks positive moving forward, that things can kind of transform. And it's sort of like you're saying that there's a transformative opportunity here in
Yeah.
the
And,
in
the,
this
I
in
was just
this
going to say,
time.
I think like there's this part in the process, right, where people they've started to relate to themselves differently, and they've done it enough times that it's starting to feel consistent. And I think the moment that they recognize that, it's like they look in the mirror and they realize, hey, I'm different. And they recognize that they've earned that security. I think that's when it really kind of coheses. And from that point on, it's not just some transient thing, like it really sticks.
Well, I really appreciate that. I appreciate everything that you're saying because it's a nice way to kind of really reflect on what we're going through and sort of to accept like, sure, this can be a lonely time and there's loss in it and there's pain in it, but ultimately to tolerate that gets you somewhere. It gets you somewhere
Yeah.
new.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Right.
That
I
we can,
mentioned this in a oh, sorry, go
no,
ahead.
go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
was I was going to say I mentioned this in an earlier interview, and maybe it'll apply here. One of my favorite analysts, Lou Aaron. I don't know if you know his
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I saw him in New York City give a talk. Well, I've seen him a few times. Sadly, he passed away. But one of the things that he said in one of his talks is kind of a random throwaway comment that was so profound to me. Was in the midst of telling a story. Somehow he kind of just worked in this sentence: grief implies a transformation by the loss. that,
Huh.
that grief is like a transformative experience. And so it's, it may not be that in any moment you're transformed, but you're talking about kind of if you step back and look at the big picture, the existential picture,
Yeah.
having gone through this will get you somewhere new inside of yourself.
That's right. That's right. It's like um, going through that journey changes you,
Right.
and just being able to kind of recognize that you're on that journey is transformative in and of itself.
Yeah. Well, very cool. So, Dr. Spiegel, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that we didn't cover, or a question that I did not ask?
I think that probably does it. I probably would have a lot more I could think of, but I'm also looking at the clock and I've got to go meet with the client.
Absolutely. I'm aware. I am
So
aware of
that's
that.
like, part of the funny part of doing these Zoom sessions.
Right. It's like you've got to fit it into your new life, the new normal.
Right, right.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to talk to me, and to give our listeners, some perspective on what they're going through. And hopefully they found it useful.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. And it's just really fun getting to talk about these things. And, just I think that the best part about the therapy process, and I was kind of reminded of that in our interview, is just like the richness and aliveness and kind of the way that people's minds are engaged and bouncing ideas off of each other. And that was a lot of fun to get to experience that today together on your show.
Oh, well, thank you. I know it's
Yeah,
certainly fun for me. I've really enjoyed that, in this
yeah, me
interview
too.
and in my other interviews. It's been really cool. Yeah. Well, so I guess I will sign off. Thank you again, Dr. Spiegel, for coming to talk to us. And hopefully I can have you back again, on the other
It's been a
side.
pleasure, and I would love that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, Germantown. This is Stephanie Heck. I'm the host of the Not So Hidden Agenda. You have been listening to my recorded Zoom interview with psychologist Eric Spiegel on quarantine loneliness. If you missed any part of this and you want to hear it again, there will be a podcast on Mixcloud on my Mixcloud page, mixcloud.com/the Not So Hidden Agenda. There's also a G-Town Radio Mixcloud page where I think it'll be posted if you want to search for that. And I will be signing off. I will catch you at the next episode. So take care, Germantown. See you later.